Whew. Last night was a long night, and I've been sitting here today thinking about someone special to me. I can't go very far this time of year, it being Thanksgiving here in America, without thinking about my grandmother. This is right about the time of the day that we should all be sort of wandering around the kitchen trying to taste a pie or eat a deviled egg and getting yelled at by Grandma to get out of the kitchen because the food would be ready any minute. I say yelled, but she always did it nicely. The kitchen was her domain, and she loved being in there. She's a little older now, and she can't quite cook Thanksgiving up like she used to, but I still enjoy going over there and having a taste of home. My grandfather isn't with us anymore, but that was always the time of year I remember sitting in the living room and watching westerns with him, or listening to him play the guitar, or just listening to him tell stories, kind of like a certain other grandpa we know. So, for today's stories, I think we're going to have a grandparent-centric story time. I hope you guys are in the mood for that, and I hope maybe you're spending time with your own loved ones this Thanksgiving, or whatever today is to you. I don't know. I know other countries have other things, but I'm from America, so today is Thanksgiving. But regardless, let's lean in and find some stories and some time together as we come into yet another cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. We all have a relative that's maybe not as friendly as they once were, or was maybe never friendly to begin with. Maybe it's due to alcohol, maybe it's due to not getting along with other family members who are close, but maybe it's due to some choices they've made in the past. On that note, let's settle back and listen to Great Grandpa's deal. When my parents told me I was going to be sent to take care of my great-grandfather, I was very hesitant. My great-grandfather, Iman Franger, celebrated his 110th birthday in December. Not that anyone had been invited to his party. Actually, there had been no party, because my great-grandfather was a shut-in. He was a famous horror writer, writing and publishing stories since the turn of the century, and he was supposed to have a small fortune saved up. As such, he lived in a Mary Shelley-style house out in the middle of nowhere, toiling away at his latest work of terror. My mother had 5 sisters, and all of them had been trying to get the highly coveted spot in Great-Grandpa's will. But so far, none of my cousins had managed it. It wasn't like I wanted any of his money, but Mom was insistent. She had been after Great-Granddad's money, just like her sisters, since her early adulthood, and now it seemed that her time had finally come around. Since all my other cousins had struck out, this seemed to be her chance. She told me to go and spend the summer, and maybe some of the fall with him, and see how things worked out. Bring some of your writings with you. Maybe that'll get you in good with the old man. And that was how I came to be on my great-grandfather's porch in mid-May, preparing to stay until nearly Halloween. The house was an old 3-story that I knew was nearly a mansion from the few times I'd been there as a kid. There were 8 rooms, 5 bathrooms, a kitchen, a study, and of course, my great-grandfather's office on the 3rd floor. Sometimes you could see him through the large bay window as he sat up there, hard at work at the old typewriter he favored. He had once sat close to the window so that he could look out and perhaps be inspired by the forests or the lawns that surrounded his property. Now, it appeared, he preferred a spot away from such distractions. I rang the doorbell and was unsurprised to hear the lock click open electronically. Great-Grandpa kept no staff. Before I'd been born, a few of his caretakers had turned up missing, and after several searches of the home and property, Great-Grandpa had finally just dismissed his staff and lived alone. He had mostly relied on the kindness of his relatives, or just done without for most of my life. He was very reclusive, and I wasn't really looking forward to spending the next 6 months in his company. I'd been preparing a manuscript to send off for publication, and I figured that I would have little time for revisions if I was too busy tending to my aging grandsire and his monstrous house. Looking back on it now, I see that I really had no idea what was in store for me. The house had a musty look to it, like some old Gothic construction from one of Great-Grandfather's novels. I don't know if this was intentional, but it gave the place a very uncared-for look. I had to wonder what my cousin Leslie had actually done here when he stayed for 8 months last year. The floors were dusty, the drapes in the kitchen were growing a fine crop of mold from a leaky window, and the whole place just had a very dank smell about it. Given the house's age, this was no surprise. The house was well over 100 years old, and had been both my great-grandfather and my grandfather's ancestral home. Now, it was little more than a hulking relic that sat waiting for my great-grandfather to die so some construction company could turn it into a strip mall. A speaker crackled in the foyer, and the buzzing sound made me jump a foot. "Don't just stand around counting the silver. Come up to my study. I have orders for you." Even at 110, it sounded as though he hadn't lost the steel in his voice. So I climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, wondering how my great-grandfather made it up and down these stairs every day. He must come down to eat, I reflected. He hadn't had anyone to help him since Leslie had left 6 months ago. As my young, sturdy legs made the climb up the creaky old boards, I reflected that I was nearly winded as I came to the second-floor landing. I would soon become quite intimate with those steps in the months to come, though. My grandfather sat in the topmost room, a room that had once been the attic. The second set of stairs had been built just for him, and they were steeper than the original set by far. As I came up the stairs, I could see my grandfather's desk and the battered old wing-back chair he had owned since I was a child. The desk and the chair sat in profile, and it was like a scene from a movie. The camera would start a slow pan in and mount the stairs, and the audience would see the back of the red upholstered chair and hear the clicking of the keys. He sat hunkered there like a gargoyle, arthritic fingers tapping away at the keys of his old battered typewriter. The sound was skeletal somehow, like bones against ivory. He kept right on clocking away as I stood a respectful distance behind his chair, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with this ancient writer that I must share quarters with for the next few months. The attic room was the size of a normal studio apartment, and appeared almost Spartan in its furnishings. There was a bed, small and neat, several sagging old bookcases that looked equally as infected with mold, a rug that stretched from the landing to his dark mahogany desk, which sat ever facing into the corner. He had once faced it towards the large picturesque window that looked over his property, but now it looked only into the corner, as though someone had put my ancient grandsire in time out. "I understand that you are to be my new caretaker." I jumped a little, the clicking leading me to believe that he would go right on ignoring me for a little while longer. His voice was creaky, raspy from lack of use. I expected to see dust puff out from behind the chair, and when he turned, I decided that my expectations hadn't been far off. To call my great-grandfather ancient would have missed the mark. The man was shrunken to the point of elvishness. He could not have been more than 4 feet tall, and his arms and legs looked shrunken and childlike. His arms were held out in front of him, hands held down at the wrists in a way that made me wonder how much it must hurt him to ride on. His legs hung an inch above the floor as he sat in that monstrous chair, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child sitting in his father's seat. The image was more grotesque than humorous, however. "You should know that I have high expectations for my helpers. I give no special treatment for family members. Your life here will be hard, but focus on the silver lining. You might just manage to acquire that oh-so-coveted spot in my will that my children and my children's children and now my children's children's children seem so incapable of garnering. Anything is possible, I suppose." And when he shrugged his shoulders, I imagined that I could hear them grind together. Listening to him talk was like watching a particularly talented bit of ventriloquism. His accent was plummy, cultured, and far too deep for the child-sized creature residing in that throne. I expected someone to poke their head out from the back of the chair any minute now, and laugh, saying how they had gotten me. When we both ended up staring at each other for the next few seconds, and no grand revelation was revealed, he went on. He told me about his meal schedule first. He ate breakfast at 5, lunch at 11, and dinner at 6. He subsided almost entirely on Campbell's soup, of which he had a large supply in the pantry. There were 7 different flavors of soup, one for each day of the week, and every month there was a number I would call to have more delivered. He told me that I could make a list of food I wanted as well, and that they would be delivering it to the house with the order. "Just keep the bill under $500 a month," he droned. "I would like to remain in funds until I die." He bathed every night at 7. While he assured me that he didn't need help bathing, he would need help getting to the bathroom, into the tub, out of the tub, and back to his room. I was to put him in the tub and then leave until summoned again. He would be fully dressed again, and when I arrived, I would help him back to his room. His schedule, other than that, seemed to be writing. He wrote sometimes for 18 or 19 hours a day, and would often write well into the night if the mood took him. He rarely slept, he told me, and I would likely find him napping in his chair if I needed something early in the morning. He slept most often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I was not to disturb him or make any noise between those hours whatsoever. "When you're my age, you find you just don't need to sleep as much as normal people. But I won't have the little that I do get disturbed by your needless clatter." My duties, other than feeding and bath time, were my own. I would like the house swept once a week, the windows opened once a week to air out the dust, the drapes taken down and washed once a month. I have a sneaking suspicion that feckless cousin of yours didn't accomplish any of these things, so it's likely a mess down there. I do not own a TV, nor do I have internet. There is a phone in the kitchen that you may use if you should need to, and while I do have electricity, I expect you to turn the lights off behind yourself. I seem to recall that your cousin Winifred racked up a $400 power bill while staying here, and I ejected her for it. So long as you follow my rules and keep the house, I suspect I will ignore you for your stay here, and you will have no hardships. He dismissed me after that, and thus began my time in my great-grandfather's house, a time I would come, in later years, to regret undertaking. It first began with the typing. My grandsire hadn't lied. He wrote 18 or 19 hours a day, and the keys of his typewriter were loud. You could hear him typing away from anywhere in the house, and the noise became a constant background drone. Using my hotspot on my phone, I was able to get some writing done, and my proofreading was coming along very well. It was slow, and the signal out here was poor at best, but I plucked away at it as dutiful as I could, despite the distracting sound of all that clacking. The sound almost seemed to scuttle, worming its way into your ears like phantom fingers as you sat trying to concentrate. I tried playing music, I tried using earbuds, but no matter how high the volume, the sound seemed to clatter against my senses like a badly played piano. I began to become rather sympathetic for a certain Poe character, having my own telltale heart clattering at all hours of the night. On sunny days, I would even take my laptop out onto the lawn and get some work done. Though it defied all logic, I imagined that I could hear that typewriter, even on the porch, or on the way to the mailbox down the lane, easily a half-mile from the house. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I heard, and it invaded not just my waking hours, but my resting hours as well. That's also how the dreams started. Sometimes I would dream that it was me sitting in that big old chair, typing away for hours on end as the words just came sliding up the paper. In my dream, the paper was never ending. It simply rolled on as it came out of the typewriter. The words rose like a tree in the forest before my very eyes. My fingers would clack endlessly on the keyboard, my young, strong digits becoming withered like great-grandfathers as I typed my life away. I was always in front of that big bay window as I worked, watching the fireflies out in the woods as they frolicked. Sometimes, though, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirrored glass and jolt awake as my great-grandfather's face looked back at me. Then there was the whispering. The whispering had likely been there from the start, but I didn't pick up on it for several weeks. Great-grandpa didn't own a vacuum, so I was stuck sweeping the floors and taking the drapes outside to beat them with a broom. Fortunately for me, carpets were not all the rage at the turn of the century, and Great-grandpa had hardwood floors throughout. I was sweeping the second floor when I heard a spidery whisper coming from the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was nearly unintelligible, the voice the thinnest of whispers, but my great-grandfather was unable to match it in his response. "I won't. You can't make me. You don't even know if he could take my place. It doesn't matter. I won't curse him with the same life I've been cursed with. Stop whispering in my ear and let me finish." Then came the loud crash of keys resumed, and Grandpa ignored whoever had been whispering to him. I I thought about it as I swept, unsure what to make of it. Who had he been talking to? More importantly, who had he been talking about? I knew that he had no phone up there. If he needed something, he always called down the stairs, and the whispering had sounded like it was coming from right inside the room as opposed to a phone. I shook it off as the senile ramblings of the old and troubled man and went about my chores, wanting to get them done so I could return to my own work. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time I heard those whispers. I began to hear them in more than just Grandpa's study as well. They began as something like the scrabbling of mouse feet, a skittery noise that scrabbled across my senses sometimes. The longer I listened, the more I heard, and what I heard was frightening. They whispered about far-off places and foreign hellscapes. They whispered about terrible devils and ancient evils, all of which would win in the end, despite the hero's best efforts. I heard them sometimes in my sleep, a place I could not escape them, and they often filled my dreams with terrible prophecy. The work was literally the third indication that something was amiss. While Grandpa's genre had always been horror, I was more interested in fantasy and YA. My current manuscript was a puff piece, something to get my name on the desk of an agent or a publisher so I could work on more groundbreaking fantasy. My story was good, warring vampire clans and a romance that was trying to blossom amidst the chaos, but it was nothing new. It was a safe bit of YA pseudo-fantasy, the kind that had a built-in audience and was fairly safe. The longer I worked on it inside Grandpa's house, though, the darker the story began to become. Characters began to die more often, backstories became less teen-friendly, and a shadow fell across what had been a fairly light little book up until that point. A lot of my time seemed to be spent fixing changes I had made the day before, and I was getting frustrated with the shifts in tone that seemed to be trying to take place in my story. It was as though someone was also whispering in my ear, telling me to spill blood or inject horror where none was needed. I found my mind wanting to write things that I'd never been interested in before, and the feeling made me uneasy. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my great-grandfather reading some of my editions from the other side of the table. I had fallen asleep at the keys, and when I woke up, I saw his spindly arms scrolling down as he read. It was clear he didn't like using the computer. He made a face every time he had to touch the keyboard, as if putting his fingers on it was something unpleasant. And when he saw me noticing him, he turned the computer back towards me. Then, he did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He smiled. "You write well, boy. It's a little fluffy for my taste, but it appears that I'm not your target audience. How long have you been writing it?" I told him I'd been writing my current work for about a year, but I'd been writing in general for most of my life. He nodded, seeming to like the taste of this new information. "Thought I was the only one, at least since your Uncle Stephen passed." Then he slid out of the chair, his feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor, and ambled back upstairs. After that, I seemed to notice him hovering around the dining room often as I made corrections and changes to my manuscript. At first I tried to ignore him, not wanting to make it awkward, but as the weeks tripped by, I asked if he'd like to come help me with my revisions. He declined at first, saying he needed to get back to work. But over time, he actually came to sit with me and helped me labor through the 500 pages of tween trash, as he often called it. Every new revision, the darker ones at least, seemed to interest him, and I found myself taking his suggestions more than I rejected them. Then, one day around Halloween, he invited me to his study. He said there was something he needed to show me. He was standing by the gigantic wingback chair when I arrived. He looked even more like an underfed child as he slid a hand over the arm, his head only slightly taller than the arm of the chair itself. "You've impressed me, son. Your writing is a little rough, but I suppose that all writing looks rough after a century of it. Many people have asked me how I've lived so long, and writing is the secret to my success. The writing, however, is only half of it. The other half is this." He stroked the chair again as he said it, a look between loathing and loving crossing his face. "Your chair?" I asked skeptically. "Not my chair. This chair was never mine. It was loaned to me on the grounds that I use it for its intended purpose." "And what purpose is that?" I asked. feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "Terror," he answered. I almost expected to hear thunder rumble outside as he made this exclamation. "The chair is meant to spread terror?" I said, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Great-grandpa didn't seem to notice. He just kept looking at the chair in that loathsomely fascinating way he had. The chair seemed to have him under its sway, and he was powerless to cleave from it. "The chair is a conduit. Its purpose is simple, to spread fear and to propagate terror. You've heard the whispers by now, I'm sure." I nodded, hearing them scurry across me even now, as I watched my grandfather stroke the old chair that suddenly seemed to be shallowly respirating before my eyes. "From the second I read the changes to your manuscript, I knew it had gotten in your head. It calls to you, just as it called to me, and now it wants to make a deal." I took a step back from the chair. "What are you talking about? A deal? What sort of deal?" "You can write forever. Write as much as you want, and your work will make you the kind of money that puts normal men to shame. All you must do is sit in this chair and let it work through you. You can do that, can't you?" I wanted to refuse him, this grinning skeleton in his slowly, but now visibly respirating chair. The longer I looked at it, the more I could see the baleful eyes, the fanning nostrils that were almost snake-like, the grinning mouth that sat in the seat. It looked at me, and as much as I wanted to deny what he was saying as the ramblings of a crazy old man, I couldn't. The chair's glamour had slipped away, and now I could see the monster that lay beneath. "Come sit," he beckoned. "Come sit and let it show you its power." I didn't want to. Sitting on that thing was the last thing I wanted to do, but I found my legs had other ideas. I had moved as if by magic, my legs that of a puppet's on strings. I expressed all my will, but I was a child resisting a hurricane. Great-grandfather moved aside as I came before his throne, and when my bottom slid into that hoary old thing, I expected the teeth to gobble me up. Instead, I was filled with something unexpected. I was filled with completion, a sense of homecoming. I was complete. I saw myself reach for the typewriter, as I had done in my dreams. The whispering beckoned me to write, compelling me to spill my talent for it, and I obliged. The words rolled from me. They weren't mine, not mine at all, but they oozed from my fingers like blood. My words became the click-clacking of the keys. My mind was a chalkboard fit only to be wiped and filled again and again. I was taken over, possessed, and the demon of inspiration capered through me. There was no endless paper now, but I saw the sheets filled and refilled again and again, made full only to be exchanged by another, and as I looked down at the ivory keys, I felt my sanity reassert itself as I saw the stains on that virgin ivory. They were dark, old blood, but they would surely be wetted again. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. I was lying on the bed in my great-grandfather's study. He was sitting on the edge of it, looking even more childlike as his legs dangled. It occurred to me how infrequently I saw him away from his keyboard in all the months I'd been here, and he looked both forlorn and greatly relieved as he watched his withered feet swing. "You did quite well. The first 300 pages of a manuscript that will soon grace the New York Times bestseller list, I am certain. At least, my agent seems to think so. I never have much of a head for popular fiction." "What?" But I realized I didn't know what to ask. "It kicks like a mule, don't it, son? I remember the first time I experienced it, back in 36, or was it 26? Who can remember? I was edging towards middle age then, kids out of the house and off on their own, and your great-grandmother had just died of a sudden pneumonia. I was alone in this mausoleum, sure that I had maybe one book in me, but unsure of how to coax it out. The man I bought the chair from showed up out of nowhere, showed up as if I had summoned him, and said he had just what I was looking for. Then he showed me this ghastly hulk you see crouching over there, and I was highly skeptical. My eyebrows slid up even more when he said that
it had already been paid for.
He got a dreamy look on his face, as though his mind was casting back through time.
He told me that all I had to do was write, just write, and the chair would do the rest. He told me that the chair would take my writing into heights that no one had ever dared hope, and all I had to do was shake his hand. When I sat down to begin, the man tipped his hat and grinned like an imp. I never looked back. At first, it was thrilling, churning out stories, books, whole series over the course of years. I was detailing my legacy at a breakneck speed. I was like a dragon, looking up to see decades pass by as I sat before my window.
His dreamy look became melancholy then, his toes flapping bonelessly as his legs rose and fell like lunatic jackstraws.
This is my legacy, boy. This is the inheritance that all my children and all my grandchildren and all my great-grandchildren have struggled for. The money, the house, the land, none of it matters. My inheritance is that chair and that typewriter and a legacy of stunning horror. It is a mantle, and if you chose not to take it up, I would understand. But, and I know from experience, if you don't take it up, you'll drive yourself crazy thinking about what could have been. You'll wonder if the success you have couldn't have been greater, if the joy you felt could not have been more, and if your years upon the earth could not have been better spent.
He looked at me then with such naked hope that I realized what it would mean if I took this burden from him. He would die, but it seemed he was ready to die. His legacy would be mine. The paper would say that the talent ran in the family, and it would continue to run until I passed it on or fell to dust. In the end, I can't even say that I did what I did to save my great-grandfather from his continued suffering. In the end, I did it because he was right. If I didn't do it, I would always wonder what if. He extended his hand to me.
The papers are signed and sitting on my desk. The house, the land, it's all yours. Everything. And everything that comes with it, he emphasized. I'm proud to say that my hand didn't shake as I took his. On the third pump of his arm, my great-grandfather turned to dust, and I was left to sit and watch him scatter across the place he loved so much. Then I took my place in the mouth of that great beast and began to write. I would continue to do so for a very long time. It's been so long since I watched my grandsire dissolve before my eyes. In that time, I've been the most prolific horror writer of my age. I've built up money like some old dragon, sitting on my wealth as I hunker on my hill. Sometimes my relatives come to see me, but most times they don't. My own mother refused to talk to me after her great-grandfather left everything to me in his will, but I hardly noticed. She died a few years ago, or was it a few decades? I didn't attend the funeral. Being away from my work for too long makes the whispers less quiet. I travel some, as my grandfather must have done in the beginning, but I never stay away for long. The stories must be told, the conduit must be maintained, and I must remain the keeper of this black lighthouse. It takes a toll, though, to be certain. I understand why my great-grandfather slept so little. If I cannot continue to expel this darkness, it pools inside me, and the vivid nightmares often bring me screaming back to reality. The bags under my eyes have become luggage, and yesterday I glanced up into the window and thought I'd seen a ghost. The old man that looked out from it was withered and sunken, and I thought that great-grandpa's ghost had returned to torment me. I see now why great-grandfather moved into the corner after a time. I'm not entirely alone, though. My cousins have gone on to have children of their own, and sometimes they send them to me, as I was once sent. One of them, a girl named Katie, is on her way now. I've heard that Katie is a rather prolific poet, and said to be quite talented. We shall see what the chair makes of her. Who knows? Perhaps I might be allowed to stop too before long, and bask in the comfortable blackness that awaits me as well. As I sit here dozing,
you can be certain that I'm dreaming of turkey and dressing, and hoping that maybe next year I'm a little closer to home. Those of you who have seen my live streams know that that's a wish I might very well get come next year. We all have someone who loves us, I hope. Maybe that someone, though, can be a little overbearing sometimes. Maybe not quite as understanding of boundaries as we might like them to be. Well, let's hope that person for you isn't as bad as the subject of today's story. But nonetheless, let's learn a little more about Grandmoms Love.
I don't know if anyone's going to read this. I don't even know if anyone will care. But I have to tell somebody. It's too much to process right now, and maybe if I get some of it off my chest, it will make it easier to handle. I'm getting ready to go into the unknown, and I feel like someone needs to know why. Someone needs to know how it came to all this, and how I came to be a potential murderer/avenging angel. Above all else, I need to tell someone about Charlie. I'd known Charlie since we were in grade school together. Charlie thought of us as brothers, since he didn't have any of his own, and loved us like family. Despite that, never think we were the most important people in Charlie's life. No, the most important person in Charlie's life was his grandmother. Charlie's grandmother, he'd always called her Grandmom, was the one who raised Charlie since the day he was born. Charlie's mother died in childbirth, and his father died before he was even born, so without a guardian, that just left Charlie and his grandmom. Grandmom and Charlie. Charlie's grandmom lived out in the country, in an old wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and acres of fields for growing things. She rented the land to sharecroppers and must have done pretty well for herself because Charlie couldn't recall a time she'd ever had to work. Charlie didn't have any other family, none that he'd ever met anyway, and for the first 8 years of his life it was just the two of them alone in that farmhouse. Charlie said he remembered being sick a lot as a kid, and most of his earlier memories were he and his grandmom on the couch while she nursed him back to health from one illness or another. Grandmom would sit at home with him while he convalesced, watching Sesame Street and eating whatever Grandmom could whip up in the kitchen. Most days, Charlie would just spend the whole day on her lap while she rocked him and hummed strange little Russian songs to him. Grandmom wasn't originally from here, you see. She had emigrated during the Second Great War, and she and his grandfather had moved out to the country because it reminded her of her childhood home. Coming from the old country, she had all kinds of folk remedies, good-tasting recipes, and strange little songs that she would sing to Charlie as he drifted off to sleep or lay sick on the couch. One in particular that Charlie recalled fondly had become a ritual of sorts, a ritual that goes on to this day, I assume, that took on the normalcy of time and repetition. She would take him on her lap, pull his face close to hers, and place her hands on his cheeks as she put their foreheads together. Charlie recalled the bumpy, veiny skin there beneath his smooth baby skin as she did this, and the warmth that always seemed to radiate from her. With their foreheads pressed together, she would sing a strange song to him in her thick Russian tone before releasing him and planting a kiss on his forehead. "What does it mean, Grandmom?" Charlie would always ask, and the asking was as much a part of the ritual as the ritual itself. "It means," she would say in her warm, gravelly voice, "always together, even when apart, always a part of me, here in my heart." Charlie had never thought it was odd that he lived in relative isolation with his grandmother. Not until he started school. His grandmom had tried to homeschool him for a few years, but her teaching wasn't up to the state standards, so she had grudgingly allowed Charlie to attend public school. Here Charlie came into contact with other children, and first learned how strange his situation was. In class, we would do assignments or draw pictures of our family, and Charlie's was always the smallest when put up on the bulletin board with the rest. Charlie began to wonder why he didn't have any uncles or aunts or cousins, or any family besides Grandmom. When he asked her, though, she always shrugged and gave him the same answer. "Your grandfather and I had the one child. Your father was not a strong boy. He was sick, often like you are, and we were afraid to have another. By the time he was old enough to over his sickness, your grandfather was dead, and it was only me and your father." That made Charlie feel a little better. His father had been like him in that sense, sickly and alone with his grandmom, so it couldn't be that strange. That didn't stop the other kids from teasing him, though. I remember Charlie when he first arrived at school, and the other kids had him pegged as an oddball from the get-go. Going to school in the early 90s, it was all about,
how cool you were, how many cool things you had on your clothes. Charlie showed up the first day of school looking like the boy from the hot chocolate box my mom always bought. He wore suspenders and stockings, knee boots, and shirts with weird fringes on them. He stuck out like a sore thumb. This, mixed with his funny way of talking and his stunted knowledge base, made the other kids think he was slow and kind of a dweeb. He came in for quite a bit of ridicule, and I recall it was a hard couple of days before my friends and I got involved. This is where I come into Charlie's story, I guess. I had never taken part in the teasing, and over time I began to feel bad for him. I pushed some of my friends to invite him to play with us, and we were surprised to find not a dumb kid, but an imaginative kid, who joined in our games eagerly. His grandmom, had taught him a little Russian, which we thought was just the coolest, and we gave him some of our old clothes to wear so he didn't stand out quite so much. Together, we played G.I. Joes or superheroes or whatever the game of the day happened to be, and outside of play, we helped Charlie stand up for himself and make the bullies stop. As we got older, Charlie stayed at our place a lot, and we really helped him come out of his shell and adapt to life outside of Grandmom's house. We were friends with Charlie all the way through high school, and after high school, we all thought we might get an apartment together. Zach, Tristan, Charlie, and I, so we could attend college together. Charlie was hesitant. He didn't want to leave his poor old grandmom alone in the middle of the woods. So when he turned up at the house a few days later with a scant few possessions, I was pretty surprised. He had 2 plastic bags of clothes, a zipper bag of toiletries. After some coaxing, he told me he and his grandmom had had a really nasty fight. This surprised me, because I'd never heard of Charlie's grandmom ever raising her voice to him in all the time I'd known him. And he seemed just as shocked about the outburst as we were. She had refused to give him any of his stuff, except what he'd brought with him, and told him not to expect her to send him money or anything else. If he moved out now, he was on his own. You could tell how upset he was, poor guy, and we helped him out as best we could. He ended up sleeping on my couch until his first Pell check came in, and after that, he just kinda made do. I had expected that would be the end of his closeness with his grandmom, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After a few weeks of silence, she went back to calling him every day, and to our astonishment, he made plans to have dinner with her and help her with her shopping. She would send him money sometimes, and he would go over several days a week to eat dinner or lunch, and slowly things began to return to normal. She still wouldn't let him take any of his stuff out of her house, but he got some new stuff, and by the time his first semester was done, he had everything that he needed. Things went on in this way for about 3 years, at least until last Wednesday. Charlie and I had just got back from class when he got a call from his grandmom. His face fell as they talked, and you could tell that Charlie was barely holding back tears. She hadn't been doing well for several years, nearly from the time Charlie moved out, and I personally thought it was a guilt trip to keep her grandson close to home, though I'd never say as much to Charlie. He talked to her for a few minutes and then immediately went to his room and packed an overnight bag. He told me to tell his counselor that he had a family emergency and needed to go home to be with his grandmother. When I asked him what was going on, he told me that she was dying and she wanted him to stay with her until she passed. I commiserated with him and told him to give her my best and to stay in contact so we knew when he'd be back. That was a week ago, and it was the last time anyone has ever seen or heard from Charlie. His car is gone, his things are gone from his room, and Charlie has disappeared without a trace. I drove the hour to his grandmother's house, hoping to find some clues when I got there, only to be greeted by a stranger when the door opened. She was a tall, dark-haired woman with lank hair and a swollen, pregnant belly, and she was no one I had ever seen before. Yeah, hell, Charlie and his grandmom were the only 2 people I'd ever seen at the house before now. She claimed to be a distant relative that had inherited the house from Charlie's grandmother when she died. She didn't seem to speak English very well, and was completely unsure as to who Charlie was or where he had gone to. We quickly lost patience with each other, and she yelled at me to leave before she called the authorities. I seethed all the way home, but I couldn't get any answers out of her. I got my answers last night. It was around 2 a.m. in the morning when something woke me up from a deep sleep. My legs were full of pins and felt like someone was sitting on them. I rolled over, thinking one of my roommates had wandered in drunk, only to find Charlie sitting on my bed. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was wrong. Charlie looked bad, withered somehow, like a grape that gets left in the crisper drawer for too long. Or a corpse after it's dried out in a grave. He spoke to me, his voice a rattling rasp in my ears, and told me that something had happened. He'd gone to be with his grandmom. He found her on her deathbed, and she'd reached for him with her withered arms when he'd come in. He'd slumped, weeping by her bedside, and she'd reached out with her wrinkled hands and touched his face. He looked at her, and she had asked him to put his forehead against hers so she could say the words one last time. She was my grandmom, and I loved her. How could I deny her anything? He said, his voice racked with pain. So he let her draw his face to hers, and she said the old familiar words as she always had. Always together, even when apart. Always a part of me, here in my heart. But when she kissed him on the forehead, his lips already starting to ask what it meant, he felt something strange. It was like she was taking everything from me. My breath, my blood, my bones, my seed, and all with that single kiss on my forehead. As she had taken all of it from him, he had crumpled up into a dried husk as she changed before his eyes. Her hair darkened, her skin tightened, her eyes sparkled, and he said that her belly had grown large even as her breasts grew heavy with milk. When she stood over him, she was 50 years younger, a girl of 20, and I realized that she was the woman who had opened the door for me. She stood over him, cackling at his desiccated form, and her face was devoid of the love that had always been there. Now you'll see why I have kept you close all these years. Now you'll see the fruit of my labor, just as your father did before you and your grandfather before him, she said, looking down at Charlie without pity or remorse. Why? He asked huskily, his voice dry as a desert. Why have you done this? Why? This is the state that befalls all your line. Males for centuries and centuries. Males from the first of your name to crawl upon this earth. He told me I was ugly. He spat on my love, and he promised me that I would never have him. I promised him that I would have all of his line, bear them and break them. So I have from that time on. Your son, she said, and gave her belly a little stroke, will be no different. And as she stood cackling over him, Charlie died and passed into the void that waits beyond. He told me all of this as I sat huddled by the head of my bed, but promised me that she was wrong. She would have no more from his line. The cycle would end with his son. He told me some things he understood now, and called his grandmother a vedma, which is the Russian word for witch. He also called her a strigoi, but he hopes he's wrong about that. A mortal man may kill a vedma, if he is very lucky, he told me, but a strigoi is another matter entirely. He made me promise if I ever called him friend, to rescue my son and kill his grandmom, once and for all. It will be dark soon, and he says that tonight will be the night of her delivery, which will make her weak. I'm leaving this here just in case I don't come back, in case someone out there might save Charlie's son if I fail. I have the things I need, and midnight will be here before I know it. I hope I'm strong enough to do what must be done. I pray I don't come to my friends in the night with a similar request. I pray that I can break this curse and make Charlie its last victim.
Could really do with a piece of lemon meringue pie right now. It's probably a little basic, but it's my favorite pie, especially when my grandma used to make it. It's one of my favorite holiday memories. Grandparents are nothing different when it comes to traumatic experiences. Maybe they served in the war. Maybe they had a turbulent childhood all their own. But let's hope whatever baggage your grandparents are carrying, it isn't quite as bad as today's story. And let's learn a little more about the last time that Grandma spoke.
My grandmother has been catatonic for the last 5 years. On the night that Grandpa died, her neighbors called the police to come check on her. They said she was screaming loud enough to be heard 3 houses down, and when the paramedics arrived, she had ruptured something in her throat. Grandpa was dead in the bed they shared, a heart attack, and they zipped Grandpa into that black bag that would take him to the morgue. They carried Grandma out on a stretcher, however. After that, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. She just laid in bed and stared at the ceiling of her room in Shady Lane Nursing Home. My grandma, always a strong lady, is fed mechanically. She wears a diaper that an orderly has to change. The physical exercise she gets comes in the form of a physical therapist moving her legs for her as she stays in bed. If she leaves the room,
It's because Denise, or Reggie, the only two orderlies that seem to give a crap about the residents, lift her into her wheelchair and take her outside, or maybe to use the resource center, which is really just a fancy word for the TV room. I begin my story in this way, so you'll know how weird today's events were. I'm a 35-year-old father of two. I've been married since I was 27 to the love of my life. I thought that after 8 years of marriage and raising kids, nothing could get to me like it did today. I'm sitting at my computer, a bottle of scotch at my elbow, sinking into a fear of returning to my marriage bed. It all started when I went to visit my grandma today. My family has a system. My mom and dad go visit grandma on Monday. I visit on Wednesday. My little sister Lisa goes on Friday. And we all go to visit on Sunday after church. My wife doesn't go every time, but she comes with me sometimes. She's known Grandma since we were 17, and she remembers her before her current condition. She wasn't particularly close with my grandparents, but I think she likes to be there for me. My grandma and I have always been close. I love my grandma, and I don't want to waste the time I might have left with her. Whether she knows I'm there or not, it's the thought that counts, and I owe her that much. I went on my lunch break today to see her. Reggie was there when I came in. He gave me a big smile as he finished fussing with her pillows. "It always warms my heart to see you and your sister coming to visit the old girl," he said. He let me know her vitals, told me about the doctor's visit she'd had last week, and then he said he'd leave us to our visit. Just me and Grandma. I took out my lunch and made some one-sided small talk as I ate. I had read somewhere that coma patients are aware that someone is talking to them, and in some cases, it sometimes helps them come out of it. Grandma wasn't really in a coma. No one really knew what was going on with her, but I like to think that maybe one day she'd come out of it and thank me for all the lovely visits. She'd say that it was my voice that had kept her going all those years. I'm pretty sure my sister just played on her phone the whole time she was there, and I'd feel like I'd helped Grandma in some way, while she was going through some troubled times. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. I was just telling Grandma about a client I had helped at work when she suddenly inhaled sharply and exhaled in a rattling, skeletal way. I paused, my hand still holding hers as it always did, and was about to get Reggie. Suddenly, the hand tightened spasmodically, and she made another of those rattling breaths, her eyes rolling wildly. She was like a frightened horse looking for an escape, and though it was the middle of the day, I felt a cold chill run through me as she shuddered and gasped in pure terror. "His hands, the hands of the dead," she breathed out. I pushed back suddenly, letting go of her clenching hand. "Grandma, are you? Oh, listen to me. I don't have much time, Bug." She was awake. Her face was pale and thin, her hands little more than fleshy claws, but she was awake. She was looking at me in that way that people look at fire exits in infernos, and as I tried to get up, she reached out again and took my hand in her cold, damp embrace. I wanted to get Reggie. Reggie would know what to do, but the naked want on her face held me in place. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. She'd called me Bug. That had always been her nickname for me. And when she said it, I realized how much I had wanted to hear her say it again. "Please, Bug, I need to tell you what he said. You need to know." She was frantic, almost pleading, and my knees sent me down without thinking. This is what she told me. They had been in bed together when it had happened. They were both at that advanced age where laying together was just that. The two were in bed, sleeping, just being with each other, when Granddad had suddenly woken her up. His arms had been around her, her back against his front. I knew from familiarity that this was how they'd slept since they'd been married since they were 17. The position was natural as sleep itself to them. His shuddering had woken her up. His hands were grasping at me. His fingers were together like a pair of mittens, and he was opening and closing like a slow, painful machine. His mouth was against my ear, and his breath was raspy and panting. He sounded like he'd been running, and as he bucked around, I knew he was having another heart attack. Your granddad's health hadn't been good for a while, but as I tried to break free of his arms, he held me tight and leaned his mouth in close. "No, Ellie, don't go, please. I'm scared. He said it, and God help me, he sounded terrified. "Don't be scared, Roy," I told him. "You'll be okay. I'll call Dr. Stevens, and I can't see, Ellie." That's what he said to me. "I can't see. They say you see the light or hear a voice, but I can't see anything, Ellie. It's all just black. All just black. I can't see his face or hear his voice." He gripped me then, hard, and I felt his nails through my nightshirt as he did it. His heart attack was bad, and I was terrified that he wouldn't come through this time. I tried to break free. I tried to get loose, but his arms were so rigid that I couldn't get away. The whole time he's just panting and telling me how there's nothing there, and it's all just blackness, and he knows there's nothing there. He kept right on repeating it, even as his voice went on and on, until finally it just went out, and then he leaned in close until his lips were right at my ear, and he breathed out one final time. That was the first time I screamed. I screamed because I was in the arms of a dead man. He was gone, Bug. He'd breathed his last, and that was that, but now I was caught in his last embrace. Her voice took on a tenuous, hysterical sound, and I remember thinking that somewhere a machine must be going off. Somewhere telemetry must be telling someone how her heart was racing along much too fast. Someone somewhere must be on their way with a crash cart or a doctor or a shot to calm her, because in this room she was close to hysterics. I wanted to get that shot. As many times as I'd prayed to God to hear her speak again, I wanted to see that man come through the door with that shot so she could slip off again. As much as I wanted her back, I knew that this was not okay. At that moment, I just wanted her catatonic again. I wanted this jittery, hysterical creature out of pain. I pulled at his hand, those long hands that would take mine sometimes, and they were hard as stone. They locked in death, and now I could not separate them. His weight was a stone around me, and I was afraid, Bug. I was afraid that I'd never get loose, that they'd find us both dead right there, him of a heart attack, and me of just plain old starvation. Her voice broke, and when she closed her hurting green eyes, I saw the tears spilling out of them. I had to break his fingers. They sounded like dry twigs when they crack in the fire, and after I'd broken 4 of them, I almost had his hands apart. That's when he came back. She whispered this as though he might hear her. Her words made my blood run cold. He'd been dead for 5 minutes, Bug. His chest was close enough that I could feel nothing beating. But all of a sudden, his arms tightened around me, and he screamed in my ear like a wolf in a trap. He pulled me hard against him. I felt my ribs trying to break, and all of a sudden, he was bucking and thrashing like the devil himself had a hold on him. It burns, Ellie," he just kept screaming and screaming into my ear. And when I finally thrust his hands apart, I rolled out of bed and got as far as I could. That's where they found me. They found me in the corner. They found me screaming. I don't know what was burning him, but I saw his last few minutes before he went out again. He writhed, he screamed, and he died in agony. What kind of place could make a man scream like that? I thought to myself, I don't ever want to go to that place. What kind of place could it be? What kind of place? What kind of place? What kind of place? She just kept right on, mumbling that phrase again and again and again until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and ran out as fast as I could. I never looked back. I don't know what I'll do next time I have to see her. I didn't go back to work. I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He let me. He's a good guy. When I called Reggie later that afternoon, he told me that she was right as rain, as usual. When he'd given her her meds that afternoon, she was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as always. He never hinted at any change in the telemetry, never said a word about abnormal vitals, just told me how much he knew it meant to her that I came to visit. Now, I'm sitting at my computer and I don't know what to do. I've been sitting here for about an hour, contemplating how I'll get on with the rest of my life, knowing my grandfather's agony and my grandmother's terror at the end of his life. I've been contemplating how I'll climb in bed with my own wife tonight, a problem that seems to be more here and now. You see, the thought of her wrapping her arms around me, placing her chest against my back, it makes me want to shudder right out of my skin. What would I do if she woke up in the throes of a heart attack? What would I do if she whispered those same hopeless words into my ear as she died? What would I do if I found myself trapped in my own dying love's last embrace?
I wonder if there's any leftovers at my parents' house. Maybe I'll call them and tell them to save them for me till I can get up there next week. I guess maybe there might be some pie left. I don't know. I might call them a little later. Everybody's got a little family history. Maybe it's the time that Grandpa got caught outside without his shoes on, or maybe it's the time that there was a skunk in the outhouse and everybody laughed as your grandmother ran back to the house. Yeah, it's kind of weird family history, but that's just the kind of thing they're into, I guess. But sometimes the family history is a little surprising, and it's important to get those cherished stories before they're gone forever. But let's not be maudlin. Let's learn about how Grandma saw a dead man once.
Grandma and I have been roommates for about a year now. That probably sounds pretty weird for a 23-year-old girl to say, but I have to say it's been a pretty great arrangement. My girlfriend and I have lived in the apartment for about 3 years now, both of us deciding that campus housing wasn't for us. Grandma may be sort of a new arrival, but I gotta say, she's probably about the best roommate I've ever had. She cooks, she cleans, doing so despite Regina and I telling her that we don't expect her to, and our laundry always seems to find its way into the closet once the hamper is full. She was one of those hippie types who missed the 60s and is incredibly chill. I don't know many other grandmothers who like to sit on the back porch at night with us and have a beer and smoke a bowl. She doesn't judge me for what most people over 50 would consider an unnatural relationship either, which means the world to Regina and I. She told my girlfriend many times that she considers her a second granddaughter, and the people in the community tell me how cool it is to have someone like my grandma in our lives. Most nights, while we sit on the porch, having a beer or two and passing around some stuff that's not strictly legal here, Grandma would tell us how this reminds her of how she and her friends acted when they were young. My friends and I would sit on the veranda and drink wine sometimes. The nights in Greece are warm, and we used to just sit in our shifts and tease the boys when they came by. It was a marvelous time to grow up. The war was a distant memory, at least for those of us who were young, and life was full of possibilities. Grandma grew up in Greece, missing the end of the war by 3 years, and she often talked lovingly about her time there. She was never very clear about where she grew up, but it must have been near the water because many of her stories involved she and her friends swimming or going to the beach with boys they fancied. She'd met Grandpa at 17, him studying abroad and her waiting tables in a cafe. She said it had been love at first sight, and he'd asked her to marry him once his time in Greece was over. He brought me back to California with him, and to me, it was the grandest place in all the world. She often told us stories from when she was young, and Regina and I usually found ourselves laughing at the antics of her younger self. She and her friends had sounded less like a group of young girls and more like a group of street toughs. Grandma told us how they had done everything from teasing boys into fighting to stealing a scooter and fleeing from the police. If it hadn't been for Great Aunt Sophie and Uncle Martin, Grandma might have been a full-fledged criminal instead of a sometimes rapscallion. They had all been happy stories, at least until tonight. Regina had come home from work, and I could tell that something was off right away. Regina's in nursing school and often has to work in the ER as part of her studies. They pay them for their time, of course, but it's expected that students will pursue jobs in the medical field so they can gain experience. Regina is usually full of stories about how she helped clear the airway of a baby, or how she got a patient to tell her that the prescription drug they had taken was more recreational than they'd let on. Grandma and I had already started our little revel without her, and she took the beer I handed her with a shaky hand. I watched her sip it for a few seconds, hands jittering, before finally asking her what had happened. They brought in a lady today. She'd been stabbed over a dozen times, and They said she had no pulse. They wheeled her in on a gurney and asked if I'd notify the morgue that they had a Jane Doe to go back. I nodded. Not your first dead body, babe. Regina shook her head. I turned to get the phone, the paramedics walking away for a moment as a call came in over the radio, and when I turned back, the woman had sat up. It was a little scary, but I thought it was just gas in the corpse or something. I turned back to the phone, and then the gurney started creaking as she climbed off. She went walking up the hall like a ghost in her sheet, and when I started screaming, the paramedics came back in a hurry. It seemed funny to me, a lady in a sheet shuffling up the hallway towards freedom, but I guess it was a little different when you were living it. Turns out she had a very weak pulse, and when she'd come in, she'd attempted to run. Her heart stopped before she got to the door, and she died right there in the ambulance bay. How terrible, I said, my image less funny now. She must have been searching for her killer, just like poor old Victor, Grandma said, patting Regina on the arm. Who, I asked? Not sure who this Victor was that Grandma was talking about. Victor Mustroff, she elaborated. He was a handsome young man in the village I grew up in. He was quite a bit older than me, around 22 when I was 13, but he was so handsome. It was a shame what happened to him, but it was even worse what happened afterwards. I leaned forward on the cheap plastic chair I was sitting on and asked her to tell us. She nodded. It's a little scary, though. At least, it gave me a shiver when I was young. As she spoke, her eyes seemed to cloud a little, her mind traveling back over the years and the miles. It all started after Victor's murder. They didn't realize it was a murder right away, of course. Poor old Victor was a carpenter, he and his brother Isaac. The two worked for his father, Marcus, but it was pretty clear who Marcus favored. Victor was set to take over his father's operation when his father grew too old to work, and Victor had let this and his charm go to his head. He was vain, we all knew it, but he was charming, too, and his vanity was really no big deal. He dated many girls in the village, and my friends and I were even taken with him. Then, one day, he went missing. We all searched for him, the whole town coming together to look for a favored son. Isaac came with us, saying that his brother had left the job site after saying he had to go do something. We searched the woods and the hills and everywhere around the village, but we couldn't find his car or Victor. He was simply gone. A week went by with no sign of him, but most of us just assumed he had taken after some woman from out of town. Victor was prone to that sort of behavior, but this was the longest he had ever been gone. Isaac went right on working, like his older brother wasn't just gone. Marcus, however, was inconsolable. We saw him many evenings sitting on the porch, sot drunk and weeping openly. Isaac would often be trying to console him, but Marcus wanted nothing from that one. My friends and I changed sides of the street when we walked past Marcus's house, not wanting to get drawn into their arguments. Then, one night, someone said they saw something strange. I heard it around the market first. It was an older woman, someone's grandmother, who said they had been walking home when they encountered someone they thought was Victor. He was staggering on a badly twisted leg, kicking up dust from the cobbles with every shaky step. His clothes, however, looked like the kind of garments a dandy might wear. His vest was filthy. His pants left a trail of water when he walked. I called his name, thinking he might have been in an accident, and when he turned around, I thought for certain I would faint. The hair was wet and lank, the curtains seeming to spin in slow motion, and then I could see the weeping crater that was his face. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and the holes where they had been did little but gurgle and wheeze. I screamed, turning away in my fright to clutch the edge of the fountain, and when I looked back, it was gone. I scoffed at her story as other old ladies clutched their rosaries and told her she was lucky to be alive. Old women often made things up like this, I thought in my youthful wisdom, and went back to shopping. It was likely just some beggar or a scarred-up vagrant. I told my friends about it that night as we sat smoking on my mother's veranda, and we all laughed at how silly she had been. When Julia saw him that night on her way home, it changed our outlook a bit. Julia was supposed to spend the night, but she ran home after dark to get something. She was gone for a little while, longer than I had thought she would be, and when she came back, she was out of breath and sweating, close to hyperventilating. It took us quite a while to calm her down, but finally she told us that she had seen the man from the old woman's story. It was just like she said, she gasped, her face fearful as she recalled it. I was going home to get my records, and when I came to the plaza near the fountain, I heard a weird dragging sound. He came out of an alley, and I turned to see his smushed face looking straight at me. I ran as fast as I could, but it seemed that no matter where I went, he was limping close by. Finally, I hid in the market until he shambled away, but I was terrified that he would find me. We consoled her, trying to keep her quiet so that she didn't disturb my parents with such talk, and eventually she went to sleep as her fear began to ebb. The strange, shambling man was all anyone could talk about in the coming days. People saw him walking through the streets, shambling along as though looking for someone. He would always be gone whenever a group came to see him, but the longer it lasted, the more people started traveling in groups. There was a lot of speculation about who it was and what they were after, and some people thought it might be Victor. Chief among them was Miss Treda, a woman believed to be a Strega. She claimed that Victor was seeking his killer, and wanted to find his body so that they could use cruentation to find him. She had conducted things like this before, offering to help the police if they would let her display the body, but she had been turned down many times. Cruentation was something old that she believed in, and it seemed to associate guilt with the blood coming from a dead body when the murderer touched it. No one really believed in it anymore. It was an ancient practice. And besides, how would you collect everyone up to touch the body? Our town was home to hundreds, and collecting them all would be quite an effort. Most people rolled their eyes at Miss Treda, but I think a lot of them secretly believed that the shambling specter was Victor. When it broke into Marcus's house and scared him half to death, many more people thought it might also be Victor. A few people whispered in the market the next day that the spirit had come after Marcus, and there were some rumblings about checking if he was the murderer. Miss Treda had started offering money to anyone who could find Victor's body. Some young men had started roving the streets at night to see if they could follow the specter back to his place of rest, but it seemed to avoid them as easily as it avoided the constables that hunted for it. This went on for several weeks, and it was very exciting times. People sat and made up wild rumors about the stranger and what it wanted, and my friends and I were no exception. Then one night it all came to an end. I remember being woken up by someone screaming. Our house wasn't too far from Isaac's house, and when I went to my window I could see the corpse as it carried him through the streets. It had him by the front of his shirt, Isaac beating at him as it carried him towards the plaza where he had first been seen. Others were looking out their windows, watching the grim procession as it made its way through the streets. Despite the horror, many of us put on our robes and shoes and ran to see where the shade was taking poor Isaac. As he came into the plaza, it was hard for the crowd to ignore the blood that was oozing from him, his pores excreting this thick and tarish juice. Miss Treda, standing amongst the crowd by then, didn't have to tell them what that meant. Isaac had already begun confessing his sin again and again for all to hear. Upon hearing him confess, it was as though the shade folded in on itself. He collapsed, dropping Isaac and laying dead on the cobbles of the plaza. The constables arrested him immediately, and I watched him beg for forgiveness as they hung him 3 months later. His lawyer drug out the proceedings, claiming that evidence provided by a corpse was not the modern justice that he was about, but the number of people who had heard him confess in the plaza was inarguable. Isaac himself pled guilty, despite his lawyer pleading for him to be silent, and he refused to leave jail until he was led to the gallows. I heard he told people that Victor's shade visited his window every night, and he was afraid to leave the jail, fearing it might come after him. 100 people saw Victor's corpse bleed that night, 100 or more at least, and they all lived in fear of the shade for nearly a month. That was thankfully the only time I saw a corpse walk. Regina and I looked at each other, both of us trying to see if the other really believed her.
As I lay here now, Regina snoring thinly beside me, I can say that, whether I believe or not, it's a story that'll follow me for quite some time.
One more story, and then I think it's time for me to slip off to my nap and dream about pies and turkey and Thanksgivings gone by. I don't know about you guys, but here in the South, it's a pretty big tradition to take care of your family members that might be a little off. We've all got that cousin or that uncle who sustained a head injury or maybe, just isn't quite all there. And we take care of them because they're family and we love them. But it's important to heed Grandma's warning when she says that Grandpa ain't right.
I've been taking care of my grandma lately. She's been doing pretty bad, and she needs someone to help her almost 24/7. She's got kind of a bone disease or something. It's basically turning her bones into Swiss cheese. And I've had to carry her to the bathroom and room to room for the past couple of weeks. This might seem kind of tiresome to some people, but I'm glad to do it. My grandma and I have always been close. She basically raised me since my mother was never at home. If I can give back to her now, I consider it fair. She's been alone since I was in high school, and those 10 years have been the happiest I've ever seen her. She and Grandpa had been married for decades, 50 years before Grandpa just left, but they never seemed to get along. When I was young, Grandma would always come over and stay the night instead of having me come over there. Grandpa never came to our house. He mostly stayed close to home or went to work, but the few times I interacted with him, he seemed kind of off. Even as a kid, I didn't think he looked right. That might sound a little mean, but over time, he got paler and less coherent. He would mumble to himself with odd whispery things while he was watching TV. Grandma usually kept him in the bedroom with the TV on and the lights off. He disappeared suddenly when I was in the 9th grade, and it had been almost as much of a relief to me as for Grandma. So last week, when I slid her into bed and told her I was going grocery shopping the next day, so, she better get some sleep, she shook her head and looked away. I doubt I will. I think this might be my last night in this bed. Why, you eye in my bed? I'll swap you, but yours is a lot more comfortable than the one I'm in. No, son, she cut me off, her voice thready and weak. I think tonight might be the night I pass on. My eyes got a little big. Do I need to call Miss Sam? If you think you're going to pass, then I should get the nurse out here, too. I don't want them out here. You've been good to me, boy. I just want you here with me at the end. Besides, I need to tell you something. I need to confess my sins before I take them to heaven with me. I mean, I can call Pastor Ferris over if you need to talk to someone about matters spiritual. No, not Bobby Harris either. I want to confess to you. It's family business, and once I confess it to you, it'll be your burden to carry after I'm gone. I hesitated, thinking that I might not want this secret as I looked at Grandma's face. I had seen that face smile more than anything else, but the look she had now reminded me of something else I'd seen when I was young. It was something I hadn't noticed until I looked back through the lens of time, but Grandma had always seemed a little nervous whenever she stayed at our house. I caught her more than once checking the doors and windows, looking through the living room curtains as if expecting to see someone there. It always made me think that she was scared of someone. It was a look that always made me think a stranger was trying to get in so they could take me away. The truth, it seemed, was darker than that, though. I took a seat on the bed, willing to listen as little as I wanted to. I'm here, Grandma. If you need to tell me something, then I'll listen. She nodded, looking out the window in her bedroom like someone might be there. Your granddad didn't disappear, she said, wetting her lips with her wrinkled tongue. I killed him. That was a shock, and
My face must have said as much. She smiled, without much mirth. Didn't think your old grandma was capable of something like that, huh? No, it's just surprising. You guys lived together for decades. I'm not sure why you would choose 10 years ago to... It wasn't the first time, she said, her voice as thin as a spider web. I killed your grandpa for the first time in 1973. 10 years ago was just the last time I had to kill him. I was confused, and I said as much, but Grandma only nodded. Your grandpa, your real grandpa, died in 1972, but he didn't stay dead. She laid it all out, something that took us nearly into the next day, but she never stopped looking out the window as she spoke. I realize now she was looking for Grandpa. When the call came, I was pregnant with your mother. Your grandpa had avoided the draft by attending college and had managed to avoid it again with a waiver from the government. He was an engineer working on bridges and sewer systems in D.C., and I was looking forward to having him home for a few weeks. He had promised to come home before the baby was born, and he was excited to meet his daughter. We had wanted children for years, and when we talked, you could hear the tears on the verge of coming out whenever he talked about our future. The phone call that day, however, seemed to be the end of that dream. They said he'd been killed in a car accident, and that it had been very quick. He had been driving to a job site when someone had run a red light and slammed into the driver's side door. They said he died instantly, hadn't suffered a bit, and I suppose that should have been a mercy. They wanted to bury him in the Capitol, but I was adamant that he be buried here. I wanted his daughter to see him, to know her father, but I couldn't have known how much she would know of him. A week later, before his body was even home, I heard someone in the kitchen late one night. Grandma's voice got low, the husk making my skin crawl as she stared through the little window into the past. I must have looked aside as I came out with the baseball bat, but he never saw me coming. It was a man in military fatigues, eating a sandwich and sitting at my table like he owned the place. He hadn't bothered to turn on any of the lights, and the closer I got, the more I saw. He'd left a duffel bag on the floor beside him. There was a glass of milk sweating on the table beside his plate. His fingers slipped into the white bread, and the lettuce and tomato looked wet against the roast beef poking out. I didn't challenge him. I didn't think he even knew I was there. When I hit him in the side of the head, he went down like a sack of potatoes. I killed him in that one hit. Hit him just right, I guess, but when I went to see who it was, I felt like I might have a heart attack. It was your granddad. He was laid out on the floor, bleeding from the ears, his blood staining his fatigues. I looked up the pins he had been wearing years after the fact and realized he'd been a corporal in the army. His paperwork said he was back on leave for the birth of his child. He was on 2 weeks of leave before he went back to Vietnam. I was confused. My husband had never been in the army, and as I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I decided to just bury him in the backyard. My husband was dead, and calling up the police to let them know that this man had broken in so he could eat a sandwich would only muddy the waters. So I buried him in the backyard. No easy feat for a woman 7 months pregnant. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room folding laundry, just trying to get back to normal, when I heard a key in the front door. I heard someone coming in, set the bag down on the end table, and then I heard the last voice I ever expected to hear again. "Sorry I'm late, dear. There was something in the office I had to set up for tomorrow before coming home." it was your grandpa, dressed in a crisp white button-up and pressed suit pants. His tie was blue and white, something I'd never seen before, and it looked expensive. I'd never seen any of his clothes, and I was the one that did all the laundry. He spread his arms wide, waiting for a hug, but I couldn't move. I'd killed him. I'd killed him 3 nights ago. I watched him die, and as I backed away from him, I saw his face twist in confusion. It was painful, a look that hurt my heart. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's me. It's Wendell, your loving man." I was against the door frame, hyperventilating, clutching my stomach as your mother kicked inside me. She could sense my fear, feel my uncertainty, and she was responding in kind. He took a step towards me, and I curled into a ball as I tried to protect myself from whatever he meant to do. I expected him to try to attack me, to turn into a vengeful spirit and come after me, but instead he just wrapped his arms around me and hugged me close. "What's wrong, darling? Are you okay? Talk to me." It sounded just like him, and when I wrapped my arms around him, I realized it felt just like him, too. The smell of his aftershave, the rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek, the way his hair smelled like seltzer blue. It was all things that let me know it was him. When he hugged me to him, I gasped as I felt the lump on his inner arm where a birth defect had left a bone poking slightly out. It was him. It was your granddad, and I just leaned into him and sobbed as he helped me to my feet and took me to the bedroom. I checked the back of his head later that night when he slept, but there wasn't a mark or anything to lead me to believe that he had been the one I'd clobbered a few nights ago. I lived with that version of your grandpa for 6 months. He worked as a manager at a paper company, his degree in business instead of engineering, and he made a comfortable living for us. If I needed a reminder of the old times, however, I only had to look at the graduation photo hanging in the hallway. It was me and your grandpa in his cap and gown, and me in my best dress, smiling as his mom snapped a photo. I caught him looking at the picture sometimes, trying to rationalize it, before finally moving away to do whatever he'd been heading out to do. He was there for the birth of your mother, and I settled into a life of maternal bliss after that. Your grandfather was much the same as he'd always been, trading talk of bridges for talk of stocks and paper sales, but he was still the same man he'd always been. He loved your mother and me dearly. We never wanted for anything, but after a while, I suspected that something was off about him. It started with the sleep talking. He would mumble ceaselessly from the time his eyes closed till the time they opened again. Your grandfather had always been a prolific snorer, ever since he was little, as his mother liked to say, but now he never seemed to breathe at all when he slept. He would mumble on and on about sewers and the war and stocks and paper and raising dogs and breeding horses and a million other things. Between your mother's nightly feedings and your grandfather's ceaseless muttering, I had become ragged. I couldn't sleep with all that yammering, and no matter where I slept, it always seemed to find me. I tolerated it until one night when I heard something familiar. I came awake to the sound of someone chewing and mumbling. Where are they? Chew, chew, chew. I can't believe I had to make my own food. It's not enough that I chew, 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 went and fought them for her, but now I have to make my own sandwich. I had been sleeping on the couch, trying to get some sleep away from the muttering, and as I crept up the hall, listening to him mumble, and even the squeak of the door didn't arouse him from his nightmare. She couldn't even bother to wait for me. Chew, chew, chew. Just because my bus was a little late, I'm a war hero, a soldier, and she can't even chew. But he paused then, before gasping harshly. Ah, my head! What the hell is that? It's Maggie. Oh, God, she's killed me. She's killed me. She's bashed my head in with a bat. I'm dead on the floor, dead right by my kitchen table. My blood's going everywhere. She's killed me. The pillow was over his face before I could stop myself. I was just so ragged, so mentally fried that I knew he would tattle on me. He'd wake up and tell the police, and they'd find the body, and he'd be here alone with your mother, and who knew what would happen then? He wasn't her father, couldn't be her father, and he might hurt her or kill her, or... She looked back at me, and I could see her eyes swimming with tears. He only struggled a little, and then I had another body to bury. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes returning to the window, before continuing again. The next one was a car salesman, but he was less like your grandfather than the one before. I read something about how if you photocopy a photocopy, the quality degrades until it's almost unrecognizable. That's how this was. The next one sounded less like your grandfather than that, was paler than him, and seemed to get lost sometimes. I lived with this one for 2 years until he suddenly wandered into traffic outside our house. I told the police that this one was a cousin of my late husband, and that was why he looked so similar. The one after that bred horses, and when one of them threw him, I buried him at the edge of the range where he worked, and went home expecting to find another one. I was becoming pretty good at losing husbands by then, and when the next one showed up, I hit him with a frying pan and left him in the backyard with the others. By the time your mother came home from school, there was a new one in the living room, reading the paper. Over the years, I'm ashamed to say I've experimented on how durable they are. I pushed one off the roof after asking him to fix something for me. He broke his neck, and I added him to the growing mass grave in my backyard. I poisoned one over the course of a year until he finally dropped dead one morning over his oatmeal. I pushed one off a mountain during a hike, only to return to the hotel and find a new one there waiting for us. The copies became paler and less coherent. Their voices became softer and less substantial. It got to the point that he couldn't hold a job. His mind was like a dementia patient, and I would look up sometimes and find him watching me through the window of wherever I was. Your mother had moved out of the house by then. A retirement check from somewhere showed up in the mailbox from a company that manufactured pipes. The money was good. The money kept us afloat, but I was tired of living with this pale ghost. Then, about 8 years ago, he walked out of the house one morning and never came back. In many ways, it was a blessing. I had become responsible for him. I had to take care of him and lead him around like a child. Suddenly, I was responsible for just me again. I kept cashing those checks until they stopped coming about a year ago, and I kept waiting for the day when he'd come back. I almost dreaded it because it would mean that he had died, and a new pale copy would take his place again. Grandma turned away from the window, locking eyes with me as the night slid by outside. Now it's your secret. It's your secret and your burden. The bodies in the back are still there. I checked periodically, and though they decompose, the bones remain. I don't know if this version of your grandfather will ever come back, but you will have to watch for him now. I've left everything here for you. The house, the accounts, everything. It's yours now, and I pray it brings you joy." She lay back then, and I could almost watch the life slipping out of her. By midnight, she was dead, and when I turned to get the phone, I saw what she had been waiting for. Gramps was paler than I remembered him, but he looked exactly the same otherwise. He waved at me as he stood there before backing away and leaving the way he had come. I went to the backyard and looked, but there was no one there, and no clue that anyone had been there in the first place. We buried Grandma in a plot next to Grandpa's original body. She lay peacefully there beside her husband. The caretaker tells me that someone comes to see her, though, leaving a single wildflower behind before moving on. I don't think he'll come back, but who's to say what the future might bring? In the meantime, I called the police to let them know about all the bodies in the backyard. The sheriff came and exhumed them, asking all kinds of questions that he didn't seem to believe the answers to. He had them tested, and to his surprise, all of them came back a match for my grandfather. Dental records, DNA, hair samples, it all comes back a match, and they were all left scratching their heads. They couldn't really charge my grandmother with anything. You can't put a dead person in prison after all, and they were left with a mystery for the ages. Either way, it's nice to have the bodies gone, and it was good that Grandma got to die at peace. As for Grandpa, I guess I'll just have to wait for the day when a new one shows up. Hopefully, I won't have a body of my own to bury when he does. And with that, I think we're going to close out our Thanksgiving Comfy Horror for this year. I do hope you've had a good Thanksgiving, or Thursday, or whatever it happens to be wherever you are. But from the Dr. Plague home to you, we'd like to wish you a happy Thanksgiving and a spooky evening.